Considering the near universal criticism this game has received, it's kind of funny to me that the next game I'll be reviewing has me more nervous than this one does. But I've already put my neck out on this one. I've already said I like Dragon Age 2, and I will stand by that, and I will try to describe why in short. In short as I can in this video. I don't want it to be longer than the Dragon Age video, because I don't think it deserves that, quote-unquote. But at the same time, Dragon Age was a beautiful work of art, whereas Dragon Age 2 needs to be discussed because it isn't, basically, if that makes any sense. I still think it's a good game. So, right before I really start here, I want to say this is an overall positive review of Dragon Age 2, and if you don't want to see that, if you want to hear that, that's fine, I understand, and, feel free to not watch, but I did want to get that boilerplate out there. I thought of an analogy that really works, because I do understand why there was such a backlash against Dragon Age 2. Let me put it to you this way. Let's say you go to a really nice restaurant. Very fancy place, excellent place. There's a steakhouse just south, there's like 10 miles south of here, that would work beautifully for this analogy. I go there with my sister, and we're just, we have this wonderful meal, and it's incredible, and oh my goodness. One of those 2 or 3 hour dinners that has multiple courses and multiple meals, and it's just incredibly expensive, but it's really good. Right? You with me? So that's Dragon Age. And now, for this analogy to work, I have to kind of shift this a little bit. Let's say I go back to that restaurant in a week or 2 or 3 or whatever. And I go and I sit down and I'm like, I'd like a meal. And the menu they bring out is a menu from Red Robin. If you don't know what that is, it's a burger joint. Not a bad burger joint. And I look at that and I'm kind of weirded out. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll go ahead and have this. And they bring out a burger from Red Robin. Now, I'm still going to enjoy that burger. I did still enjoy that burger. It was fine. It doesn't even begin to compare to the meal. And the fact that it's coming from this place that previously gave me this wonderful, incredible meal of, oh my god, that was amazing, is just kind of strange and leaving me disappointed. So I'm kind of with you on this, guys. I really am. But at the end of the day, and I know this is just me and my tendency to be more positive thinking than negative, but at the end of the day, all I'm thinking is, well, at least I had a good burger. Dragon Age 2 is one of those games I call a used game, by which I mean you need to buy it not new, less than full price. And I recommended that to 3 of my friends, and all 3 of them bought it for less than new, so hey, however that works. But I really want to get, other than that analogy I just gave and a couple of necessary comparisons, I'm going to go out of my way to not compare Dragon Age 2 to Dragon Age 1, because there really is no comparison. Let's just be honest with ourselves. Dragon Age was a work of art. It was a magnificent thing. It was a beautiful, amazing, involved, developed, incredible RPG with a few flaws that were so smothered by all the wonderfulness that they don't even matter, in my opinion. And Dragon Age 2 is not. So there's no reason to compare those two. It's like the analogy I just gave. What's better, Red Robin or the best steak you've had in your life? So, now that I've got these boilerplates out of the way, I actually printed out notes today, primarily because I've got a lot of things working on my computer in the background. I don't really feel like having my notes up today, but I did have a couple things. Let's start with some of the bad stuff, shall we? The repetition in the zone usage, in the dungeons, in the areas you go through, was ludicrous. The sheer level... okay, let me get this out here. I understand the concept of deadlines. I understand that the concept of repetition is unavoidable. To use Oblivion as an example, because of the nature of the way they modeled the world and the world editor they used to do so in order to make the dungeons, a lot of the dungeons had a bit of an air of the clone brush about them, because chunks of the dungeon are literally being pasted together, and that's the same entrance chunk that it is for this one and it is for this one. So there is a degree of repetition there, and you just kind of see that in video games. But for the most part, and I will use Oblivion again as an example here, it's not too repetitious. The caves do vary. The caves do have differences about them, and sometimes it goes left and sometimes it goes down, and sometimes there's this chasm thing in the middle, It is not completely uniform. Dragon Age 2 took that and went way too far with it. The level of repetition in Dragon Age 2 was ludicrous. I don't have a better word for it. The fact that they would use the one chunk of cave, and it was bad enough, but the fact that they would actually section it off. So for this quest, you're in this little corner of the cave over here, and for this quest, you're in this corner of the cave, and there's invisible walls preventing you from going any further, because that's where the quest ends. That was insane. That was a bit much, and I don't know if that was laziness or deadline or both. If I were to guess, I would say it was Deadline, which is part of why I am willing to go ahead and not give that a pass so much as try and move past it, if that makes any sense. That is unacceptable, but at the same time, I kind of see where they're coming from. Shrug. And then, okay. The next thing they did, which I think personally was both good and bad, was what they did with the combat system. They took Dragon Age's combat system, which admittedly had some flaws, had some logical problems with it, and not everyone liked it. And they said, you know what this needs? This needs more Hollywood. And so, as I've described before, physically described before, the way that screw it. Wah! Sure! Wah! With a giant two-hander sword. Or with a staff, smash it in the ground, fling it into the sky, posing at every point, of course. The whole thing was so Hollywood. It was ridiculous. Now, I still went with that. I didn't like it per se. I preferred Dragon Age 1's, but I could still go with that because it was flashy, but it was almost tongue-in-cheek flashy, if you know what I mean. It was kind of funny in its own right, at least to me. And watching my character, who is wielding a sword bigger than she is, just going through there, was amusing to me. Now, one of the things, I'm going to segue a little bit here, one of the things I do like is that they did actually make the combat system itself a little bit more enjoyable. They made it a little more arcadey and a little less RPG, to put it in such terms. It was a little... Some people say it's more action. That's not action. That is more arcade. Action would be Devil May Cry or God of War. What Dragon Age did is point and click, And that's fine. I could go with that. And I did actually enjoy the combat a little bit more than Dragon Age's. I will go out and freely admit that. But... everything I say good about this game is going to come with this but at the end of that. It's just... However... there is a problem with that, and that is the fact that by streamlining the combat so much and making it so arcadey and so Hollywood, that what we ended up with was combat sequences would go by so much quicker than in Dragon Age. And naturally, somebody at BioWare or EA or whatever looked at it and said, that's not gonna do! And so instead of going through, a cave, and you fighting, say, a 4-pack of spiders, a 3-pack of spiders, a 2-pack of spiders, and a boss and his ads, you fight 32 spiders, 64 spiders, 108 spiders, I'm exaggerating a little bit, a lot of spiders, tons and tons of them, and they literally spawn in thin air. The game does, I'll give them credit, it does try and prefer spawn points where the camera isn't looking at the time, but you can, if you're swiveling around, as I was doing purely to test my curiosity of how they coded it, you can actually see that they literally just spawn in thin air. They just appear, I'm here. Oh. And they do it in waves, too, which gets a little old, admittedly. And nowhere is that worse than in town. Oh my goodness, you get attacked constantly in town. I'm just going down the alleyways. 50 guys jump out! Except it's not 50 guys jump out. 5 guys jump out. Oh, and then they die. But then 5 guys jump out, and then they die. And then 5 go... And the pace of which I'm describing this is about the pace of which this is going to, because I was a two-hander, as I just mentioned. So I would do Reeve or whatever it is, funk, and those 5 guys are dead. And then 5 more would spawn, and then I do Whirlwind, and they're dead. And then 5 more would spawn, and I do the bash thing. All of them are dead except one. Varric gets that one. You get my point here? The combat was streamlined, was smoothed out. I did enjoy it, except for the fact that they then decided the best way to deal with that was to make it more repetitious. I got nothing, I really do. I have no idea what they were thinking with that. I will give it more positive than negative. Net positive result for the combat. But I still I don't know what they were thinking with the sheer repetition of the constant, attacks and the constant everythings and all that. The only fight in the entire game I really thought was really well done was the duel with the Arishok. I'll go into that more a little later because that's more a character thing than a combat thing. But for the combat aspect, I do want to talk about the fact that having a one-on-one duel with someone who can two-shot you was actually interesting. It was the first time I actually had to start watching, tells in his movements and actually dodge, quote-unquote, and time my own attacks, and it was actually interesting. I got into that, so, that was cool. Could have used more than that, because all the other super optional bosses I just breezed through without even trying. But oh well, that's okay. You know what? We'll give it a pass. It was at least enjoyable in a very popcorny way, and I'll explain that analogy much later. Next thing, the dialogue wheel. They went the Mass Effect route. I should say they went the Mass Effect 3 route with the dialogue wheel. I didn't mind it in Mass Effect 1 and 2 because it was still full. It was still well written enough that you generally had an idea of what you were going to say. In Mass Effect 3, as I've discussed before, you have the Tor effect where you say, "Oh, that's a computer," and the guy is actually saying, "My God, it's a computer," and the tone is completely different, and you lose the meaning, and blah blah blah. But and just to give an example of this, the game Dragon Age 2 was supposed to track how your overall personality, either sarcastic, brutish, peaceful and diplomatic. I was going for peaceful diplomatic, and yet for some reason the game kept thinking I was sarcastic and the jokester because that's where the tone kept going. I'm not sure if that was a bug or not. Not sure. I haven't gone back and replayed Dragon Age since last year, so not really positive if that was an issue or not, but I just thought I'd mention it. But I felt a disconnect. And I've said this before, I really wish we'd go back to the old system that Dragon Age used, that Baldur's Gate used, that everything else used in the older days, of having the dialogue that you're going to say written out here, and then just have the voice actors say that. You could still have a voice actor for your main character. The concept of doing that kind of thing has at least existed as an idea since Fallout 1. Because no matter what you name your character, you're always the Vault Dweller. No matter what you name your character, you're always Shepard. No matter what you can name a character, you're always Hawk. You follow me. So it's not that hard to do. It's just they do the dialogue wheel thing, and I'm guessing that's for the consoles. That's just a guess. I'm not really positive on that. I just don't like it personally, and I don't really think it adds anything to the game. I think, if anything, it detracts from it a little bit because it removes you one more step from actually the character you're supposed to be, your avatar within the game. But moving on. Now, my next thing I want to talk about is actually technically the biggest thing in the game as a whole, in its entirety. I don't know, I don't have the exact figures in front of me. I meant to look that up before I started this review, and I don't feel like looking it up now. The writing staff changed, and a lot of the creative team changed from Dragon Age 1 and Origins and Awakening to Dragon Age 2. A lot of those writers were shuffled over to, to Tor, and so forth and so on, and EA tends to do this, but companies in general actually tend to do this, even on the small level, because companies tend to think of people as resources, not people who might actually have some kind of attachment to whatever they're working on. Even small companies tend to do that, and so what we have is basically what amounts to a new team that was said, all right, Dragon Age was like one of our best-selling products ever, go make a sequel to it. I actually have a great deal of sympathy for that team, to be completely honest with you. And I think they did a fairly good job with it overall, as indeed, because this is a net positive review, but I think one of the biggest things that they did correctly was they looked at the story aspect. And they said, there is no way we can follow that up properly. Not without the original staff working for us, not without that writing team. So they thought about their options, and they said, well, how could we do this? And what they basically came up with was, rather than Dragon Age 1 had the Darkspawn backdrop and then a lot of characterization over a fairly short period of time, right? It had a very epic feel, it had a very personal feel, it had a very I don't even know what to call it, a Lord of the Rings thing going on, It was very, I hate to call it epic because most people misunderstand me when I use that term. Something that is epic is not big and grand and grandiose and everything. Something that is epic is something that is simultaneously awesome on both ends of the scale. Yes, massive big battles, yes, massive threat, yes, the country is being saved, and yes, you're changing the world. But that also has to come in hand with the personalization, the individual stories, the NPCs, the characters you're with, caring about the people you're with, caring about your own character, that kind of thing. That's what I call epic right there. And Dragon Age 2 is not epic. Dragon Age 2 decided to go with a bit of a bridge story, and they decided to form this with the I suddenly can't think of the term, framing device of Varric talking about the story to what's her face, I can't even think of her name, with the chantry, Shalindra, I don't remember, and that wasn't a bad idea. and going in a different direction was a good idea in my opinion. And the concept on paper of doing a 10-year, a decade bridge between Dragon Age 1 and Dragon Age 3 actually makes a lot of sense if you really sit back and think about it. And I really like the fact that they tried to go ahead and have the sensation that rather than having this big threat that's sitting right there, it's someone just kind of living their life and the lives they interact with over these years. And the slow build-up, right? The slow build-up to what was going to happen in 3 and at the end of 2. Now, there's a couple problems with this. However, I should start saying that. However, couple problems. First and foremost problem, and this actually wasn't true at the time, but this is very true now. Mass Effect 3 has made my trust in BioWare go down a lot, as I've said before in detail. So, if Dragon Age 3 was intended to be Dragon Age again, with the bridge of Dragon Age 2 in the middle, I could have gone for that. The odds of Dragon Age 3 pulling that off at this point are much lower. Possible. I will still say it's possible. I will still at least look into it, but much less likely, which unfortunately speaks poorly of Dragon Age 2, because a game that is designed to be a bridge to Dragon Age 3 by default is not going to be as impacting, as tolerable as anything good, if the thing it is bridging to is not as good. You follow me on this. So there's that problem, but the second problem, even at the time, even before we knew the problems that BioWare was starting to have with EA and their issues, is the fact that it doesn't actually feel the way it should. Doing Mass Effect, Dragon Age 1, felt like it took longer than it did. In lore, that is a year. 1 year, right? And that is a fairly short period of time when you're talking about a medieval setting, admittedly. But 1 year was the entirety of the game, from the moment you start your origin to finishing off Awakening, actually. So, nice big chunk here. And Pax is interrupting me right now, because he does that. But no, okay, so Dragon Age 2 goes over 10 years, right? You know, let's just stretch this out here. 10 years, right? It should feel more paced. Not boring, not slow paced. It should feel like there is no rush. It should feel like things are taking their time and flowing slowly. But it feels the opposite. It felt very rushed. It felt very... I don't know, the whole game had that feeling of the fact, and I'm not talking about in gameplay terms, I'm talking about in terms of story, in terms of setting. The whole thing felt like you were just running through it the whole time. And there was a very huge problem that kept happening. You'd see something and it would be like, a year passes, or whatever, 3 years pass, something like that. And then you'd walk in on your next character after the fade comes back, and there's no feeling of that. If not for that 3 years thing, it would feel like it was the next day. And that's not properly done. That is bad storytelling. I'm sorry, but that is not proper storytelling. Someone failed somewhere at getting that impression across. But you can't just say it's been 5 years. You have to show that it's been 5 years. You have to give hints. They did try to give some hints. I will give credit for that. I will give the fact that there were some hints here and there. But the overall feel was very much that more like something like Dragon Age 2 occurred over a month, in my opinion. If I were actually to play it and did know it occurred over a decade, and people didn't actively say, by the way, 3 years ago, I would say it would have happened over about a month. It felt like a very short game, in terms of story. Maybe that is a product of the fact that Dragon Age 2 is a much shorter game than Dragon Age. I don't know. But it is definitely a product of the storytelling style, not quite fulfilling what it was intended to do. But I will say a couple positive things for it. The idea of having a home base for a setting like that makes a lot more sense and was a nice touch, I think. And because in Dragon Age, there was no... Having a home base in Dragon Age would have made no sense. You are... Not only are you on the run, the world is actively changing around you. The Darkspawn are spreading. The fact that you would get attacked when you were camping made perfect sense. And the fact that you had a camp, which is essentially wherever you are at the time. Yes, it was the same model, but there was the very clear impression that it was just wherever you were, which I was with. And that I'm with. Having a mansion that happens over here that's just, doing its thing, that would have just been jarring in Dragon Age. But in Dragon Age 2, it fit perfectly, because this is your hometown. You have settled in here. You have bought yourself into the nobility. And there were a few subtle touches in that I actually did like. Buying yourself into the nobility describes one of those perfectly, because very few people think about what that means. The level of success that Hawk experienced was monumental, and I actually like the fact that your character succeeds so magnificently, all way back in Act One there. But think about this for a moment. You don't just pay off a few people and get into nobility. That's not how that works, especially not in a medieval setting. No, how you buy your way into nobility is, first of all, you have to have land. So they bought land and they bought resources. They probably bought into a few businesses in the area to give them a steady income. They probably got invested in several of the trade caravans in the area, and all this gave them more income, which then gave them the ability to start going to social gatherings, that kind of thing, and showing off some of their money. Doing so would eventually get the attention of one person, or maybe two, and who are already a member of the nobility, and those people would be like, "Hey, what's up?" And those two would interact, and at that point, the other nobility will then basically move around in order to interact with the Hawk family themselves, so that they aren't left behind in the whole noble interpersonal relationship circle thing. Politics. I actually understand this whole thing very well, and I almost wish I didn't. And I'm trying to be as unboring about this as I can, because I'm really just trying to get across the point that that was a very subtle thing they implemented in there that most people didn't even pick up on, that I talked to about it, but that I thought was very well done, and I thought that was an excellent way to get across the fact that you really did strike it rich. Yes, you never saw it in character terms, but who cares? You don't need to see it in character terms. You have a mansion now. You are a member of the nobility of one of the wealthier city-states of the area. I like that. So there were subtle touches. It's just, overall, it didn't have the feeling I thought it could have. A lot of potential there, but it just didn't quite live up. Now let's talk about, while we're on story here, let's talk about characterization. There were several characters that I did actually like in Dragon Age 2. Anders, of course, not as much as in Awakening, but I did like Anders. Varric I loved. Varric was my favorite character by far. He was always in my party, every chance I got, because he was awesome. He was... I liked Varric. He was exactly the Han Solo type character I tend to really get into. Han Solo, if you prefer. Where he is definitely a rogue, definitely chaotic good, but emphasis on the good part, and he tries to hide it too, and I love it. There's one of my favorite lines is when he and Meryl are talking, and Meryl's like, "Oh, I love walking out in this particularly horrifically dangerous area of the city every night." And Varric says, "I really, really think you shouldn't do that, please." And she's like, "Oh, don't be silly. No one's ever bothered me. It's perfectly safe." And Varric just kind of grumbles under his breath, "Yeah, and that perfectly safe is costing me a fortune." I loved that. And it really spoke to his character. So, the Meryl, speaking of which, Meryl was actually surprisingly well fleshed out. Despite being, in general, an heir for brains, she was very... She is, in D&D terms, someone who has a very high int and a very low wisdom score. And she... I might be actually beating that. No, that's correct. Very high int, very low wisdom. And one of the best sequences that really explains that for her is when she and Anders are talking about justice, and Anders is describing how justice is, and Meryl just kind of says, I knew what I was getting into when I did it, because I know exactly what these demons are like, and I know how they function. I just was willing to accept this price. I'm sorry you don't fully understand that, Anders. And her tone was uncharacteristically quiet and soft for that, and I really liked that. And... who else we have? Aveline. I actually liked Aveline. I know that's weird because everyone I've heard couldn't stand her, but I liked Aveline. She wasn't one of my favorites, but I did at least care about her. I did find her interesting. I was amused and pleased, I guess, when she finally did find a new husband, because she had to kill her old one, or I had to kill her old. I forget what choice I made, but he's dead. That's the important part. He's dead. Shift it. Moving on. And the last one I really liked was Fenris. I've heard some people joke that Fenris is the Final Fantasy character of Dragon Age 2, but to be honest, that's a kind of a hard thing to refute, but I think it worked. I think it was a good addition to a game like Dragon Age 2 to have an FF character like that. It's not the fact that he's an elf. His whole backstory was incredibly tragic and totally screwed up. He himself was a little bit on the overpowered side, let's just be honest, but that works in a game like this, with a combat engine like this. And you have a lot of opportunities to either help him become a better person, which I did, of course, and I actually really enjoyed seeing Fenris's character grow throughout the series, or do some of the most insanely, hideously evil things I've ever seen in a video game ever to him, and break his spirit so thoroughly that he basically can't even speak. We're not going to talk about that. As usual, I lend towards good because that's what I play, that's how I do it, but I will at least give them props for the fact that the option was there. And the other characters, I mean, Isabella was amusing. I'll admit that Isabella was amusing. I think that's actually all the player characters, isn't it? Now that I think about it. But of those, ultimately, Dragon Age 2 still didn't quite pull off the hat trick of me actually really caring, having the up here thing with every single one of those player characters. It came close, I'll admit it. But part of the reason it came close was because it had such a small group of characters, and one of the things they really failed at was some of the characters. Okay, let me put it this way. Those moments of really getting into the character and really exploring them and who they are and what they are exist in Dragon Age 2. You learn more about Isabella and how a person, kind of a person she is, and how she really is inside, that kind of a thing. And the same with Fenris, and the same with Meryl, and the same, the only exception there I think is Anders. But point being, those are the snippets. That there should be more of that. Dragon Age 2 was not very character driven, which was kind of strange for a BioWare game in general, and it was more event driven. And again, this is probably an intentional choice on the behalf of the writing staff to make it more focused on the events of what's going on, and the Hawk was actually definedly the main character rather than being what most main characters in a BioWare game are, which is the spearhead. Not the whole spear, just the spearhead, if you follow me here. Now, it probably says something. I'm not sure if this is really good or bad, but one of the characters I sympathized with, one of the characters I really empathized with the most, and really enjoyed the most, was the Arishok. I'm not sure what that says about me or the game, but I really did think the Arishok was pretty much spot on, pretty much perfectly done, exactly how a Kun should have been, Kunari. Someone who followed the Kun should be. I pretty much thought that was what I've envisioned as the Arishok from Dragon Age 1 in everything Sten told you about it, or the Sten if you prefer. And one of the reasons I fought so hard to get his respect and to do the duel was because I, the person playing the game, did actually respect the Arishok as a character, and really wanted to show that in the only way I really had possible. And so that was like the only thing I really made a point of doing when I was playing through was, no really. And it probably says something, and I put more effort into that than into, say, Isabella's quest, and Isabella ended up leaving me in Act 3 permanently. And, yeah, I still haven't done my subsequent playthrough in order to fix that. I'm probably going to wait on that in a while anyways. I've got plenty of games to play right now and plenty of other things to do and blah, blah, blah. The only other thing I wanted to talk about is that one of the bright spots, this is going to sound weird, in the storytelling, again, I said Hawk themselves was the main character, and it really felt, it really showed about the story. The story was about Hawk. It wasn't about the crew, it wasn't about the people, it was about Hawk. And nowhere is that more shown in what happens to Hawk, pretty much in succession. First of all, they flee the battle at Ostagar, and they're running away from Darkspawn. And most stories that start that way are not going to end either very well or very far off. They're probably going to end in about 20 seconds when the Darkspawn catch up to them. But, that was a nice touch, I'll admit, starting the story with a bang, right there, and really setting the tone for what's going to happen to Hawk, because the next thing that happens is they lose one of their siblings, depending on what class you decided to pick. Despite the fact that the default Hawk is a mage in lore, I couldn't bring myself to let the brother live. I can't even think of his name because I hated his guts. Speaking of characters, I guess there was the brother and the sister as additional characters. I actually forgot they existed. That's kind of sad. But, kind of gets my point across, doesn't it? But no, I couldn't stand the brother, so I let him die. So, even ignoring that, though, let's pull me out of this for a moment. Hawk just loses their brother, and their family's torn apart, and now they have to flee north, and there's an awesome cameo, and then we move on with Captain Janeway. And next thing that happens, as far as Hawk's family is concerned, is they get set up basically for life. And it's like, yes, things are turning around, things are wonderful, we've finally gotten the nobility, we've reclaimed our manor, everything's wonderful, right? And then you go and lose your remaining sibling to whatever. It is very possible for that remaining sibling to simply die. if you take them down into the tunnels with you. Or, of course, if you when you come back, I'm getting this a little bit out of order because the nobility thing is right after this, but you get the point. The very next thing that happens is something happens to their other sibling. They either lose them to, whatever. In the case of the sister, she was taken in by the mage circle, and or she dies if you take her with you. But then you get set up, and so it's you and your mother. You finally made it. You and your mother are great and wonderful, and you do all these adventures, and you become the champion of Kirkwall for saving the city from the Canary. And then your mother doesn't die so much as has some of the most horrible things happen to her that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm really, they, whew. I'm not sure, for any of you who don't know, what essentially happens is her head is sewed on someone else's body, and by someone else's body, I mean it's actually kind of a Frankenstein of several people's body parts, and then she is sort of given life, but not really, and she's kind of there, but not quite, and it's really gross, and it's really horrible, and then you have to mercy kill her. And there's no way around this. And for once, I actually approved of that. I approved of the lack of choice there, because the tragedy of the moment really had potential for pushing Hawk forward. Whether or not they ever actually do anything with that or not is debatable, because Hawk's story just kind of stopped. But you get my point, right? They could have done with that, and they could have done much with that. That kind of tragedy is something that can be well done. And that was a horrible moment, so I'm with it on that. And then Hawk, more or less, is directly responsible for starting a war. I shouldn't say it like that, because that war was in the making for decades, and all that happened was Hawk happened to be at ground zero at a spark, which finally set off the 15 tons of powder kegs that were there. And then Hawk basically has to leave because everyone's looking for them. So, yeah, I do think the Hawk story was well done. I think Hawk, him or herself, was fairly well characterized. I wish it had been, like other BioWare games. So, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much about characters. Let's move on here. Humor. One thing I will actually give Dragon Age 2 in spades is the humor element. Dragon Age 2 was actually quite funny. It had a lot of humorous dialogue. It had a lot of humorous references, especially the casual banter between the party members. I used to swap around who I had with me. It was actually Varric and Blah, so I'll bring Varric and Meryl or Varric and Anders, and just about everything they say was comedy. I loved it, and I've actually read several of the additional dialogues that you can have, especially between Isabella and Fenris, for example, which is just hilarious. So I don't have much else to add here. I'm just saying the comedy element was well done. I think that was an overall benefit of the game, and did kind of contribute to that popcorn feel, because a popcorn game is something that should be sort of feel good, which is ironic considering the tragic story of Hawk, him or herself. But that tragic story is almost separate from the game itself, if that makes any sense, because there's the gameplay and then there's Hawk's story, and the two don't interact as well as they should. And I guess this is kind of dipping into the negatives here, because usually when that's done properly, the two sides of the coin are actually melded, so you have one cohesive whole, like Mass Effect 2 or Dragon Age 1 or KOTOR or Baldur's Gate 2. I could keep going. These are all games done by one company. Anyways, and so the humor element though really did make it so that while I wasn't when I wasn't focused on the primary story of Hawk, and when I wasn't doing something related to Hawk, I was just having this sort of just this kind of light comedic tone going through it. I like that. I will talk about the two DLCs. We had Legacy and Mark of the Assassin. Now, neither of these were jaw-droppingly good, like, say, Lair of the Shadow Broker is, or just about anything from Fallout 3 or Fallout New Vegas, to name some truly good DLCs. But they were good DLCs. That's important. They did actually do a good job with them. Legacy actually did add to the story, actually did add to the setting, had a lot of foreshadowing, really did some good work with the Darkspawn, which Dragon Age 2 had kind of left in the background, for obvious reasons. And I overall thought that was a positive experience. The Mark of the Assassin, I really wish Felicia Day wasn't in it. And I'm sorry to say this, I just wish people would shut up about her. Yes, okay, she's there. She's a decent voice actress. She's mildly amusing sometimes. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm with it. Please shut up about her. Please stop fanboying about her. I'm sorry. I'm not talking to anyone here in specific. It's just every time I hear something, it's like what Mark of the Assassin, for example. I initially did not want to get into it and want to read it or play it or anything like that because it wasn't get the new DLC for Dragon Age 2, Mark of the Assassin. It was get the Felicia Day DLC, Felicia Day for Dragon Age 2, Felicia Day, Mark of the Felicia Day Assassin. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but all the ads were her face, her name, her character, then her face, all of it. It was just all over the place. It's like, okay, guys, I get it. Please, just what's the DLC about? It took me a little while to find that out because everything was just Felicia Day. Now, all that ranting aside, it was actually a really well done DLC. It still added to the story, it still added to the setting, it was still fun. And the boss fights were actually interesting. I said boss fight, but point being, well done overall. Props to both. I wish they had gone ahead and done their plans of making, I believe it was just one more DLC is what they were going to do rather than push forward for Dragon Age 3. But, oh well, they did to get 2 good DLCs under their belt, and that's good. That is actually good. That's a good sign, and I give them props for that. Now let's talk about a few other minor things. I've just got a couple other little points here. For some reason, Dragon Age 2 suddenly decided to really increase the vulgarity of the game, and it really had a different tone in the writing from Dragon Age 1, from anything else. It was very... And when I mean vulgarity, it's not just the cussing, because that doesn't bother me too much. It bothers me when it seems improperly used, if that makes any sense. And occasionally it would be fine, and occasionally it would be over the top, and occasionally it would be ridiculous. And it wasn't just the cussing; it was the general tone was very vulgar. I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep using that word because it fits so well. The general tone of Dragon Age 2 and the setting was vulgar, and I think that was done on purpose. It was to show off the contrast between Ferelden over there, which, as much as it was a dark, depressing, dreary area, was not very vulgar, was not very vile, was not very, inappropriate, whatever other word you want to use for that. That wasn't the focus of that general cultural area, especially not with the Darkspawn looming. Over here, there is no Darkspawn threat looming. There's no threat looming at all, actually, unless you count the Qunari sitting there, which only has a few people up in the tethers. And the overall feel of Kirkwall itself, especially, was very much just a vulgar place, And while I personally, I guess this is actually kind of a positive thing because I personally don't care for that, but I have to give props because it did add to the overall feel of that area, of Kirkwall itself, and of how different the personality and the culture and the subculture of the people who live in that region are from what from everything else we've seen in Dragon Age, we've had a few tidbits of information on what the Orlesians like. We've had, unfortunately, too many views of what the Tevinter are like, and I hope they all die. And then and Ferelden, and now we've seen Kirkwall, and Kirkwall is definitely the tawdy bar in the corner that looks like it hasn't been cleaned in 15 weeks or years. But I'm with that. Okay, I'm with that. It did actually add to the atmosphere, so I will give it a pass because it did add to the game. I may not like it personally. That may not be my preference, but I will still go with it because I did feel it actually benefited the game overall. It did add to. The sexualization of Dragon Age 2 is really confusing, though. I'm only going to talk about this briefly, but this goes along with that vulgarity. Again, the tone was very much, vulgar, casual sex. The thought of everything being sexualized and everything being sexually oriented. It felt like being in the Navy again, or not again. I was never in the Navy. A friend of mine was in the Navy, and I've heard stories, and that's all I'm going to say on that. But you get the idea. There was very much that whole, oh, women, oh, men, oh, sex, that kind of feel to it, and it was all over the place with everyone, everywhere. And yet at the same time, all the actual sex scenes were much, much tamer than anything they've ever done before, basically. The voice acted and described scenes in Baldur's Gate 2's sex scenes, I personally think, were more explicit than the fade to black we get in Dragon Age 2. Now, that's just kind of weird to me. It's just kind of the strangeness of this overall sexual tone to the game and then there's no actual sex scenes. I'm not complaining. I'm glad there's no actual sex scenes. Again, I don't want that. Optional or none, please. But it was just strange that they did that. That I can only imagine that had to do with censorship or wanting to get a certain rating or something. I really don't know. But while I'm on the subject, there is one other thing I want to add here, really quick. I usually don't do romances in video games because, to be completely honest, because I usually don't like any of the characters myself enough to do that. Liara was probably the only exception, and there's actually a story behind that, which I'm not going to bore you with right now, but let's just say I didn't mean to romance Liara. It just sort of happened. So, and the fact that it flowed so naturally was okay, yeah, I'll go with this. And I did with Bastila Shan in KOTOR, and I think it's it, actually. I mentioned the one in Baldur's Gate 2. I did that out of curiosity, though, not of any interest. But my point I'm getting across here is that none of the characters in Dragon Age 2, male or female, held even the tiniest bit of interest to me. I'm not bi, by the way, just to get that out there. I'm just saying I usually play female characters. Well, I don't usually, about half the time. 50% of the time I play female characters. And so, none of the characters were interesting to me. None of them were anything. There was no spark, there was no interest, there was no likingness. I had no problems telling Anders exactly where he could stick things because no, go away. Pardon me. And so that leads me very well into one of my last thoughts. Second to last thought here. The fact that everyone was bi in Dragon Age 2 bothered me, but probably not for the reason you're guessing. Let me just say this outright here. I've never said this here. I try to avoid controversial topics, but I have nothing against people being bi as long as that has nothing to do with me, if that makes any sense. If you try to force that onto me, go away. But if you're bi and you're off doing your thing, I really don't care. If you're bi and you're my friend, I do actually have several bi friends, 3 actually, and that doesn't bother me. I have nothing wrong with that. So that's not the problem I'm having here. The problem, and I'm not bi myself, like I just mentioned. I am into women. Sorry. But the problem I have was the fact that rather than that being sort of a statement of, equality, there we go, or, tolerance or anything like that, it felt very lazy. And let me explain why from a coding perspective. What do you think is easier? Coding in these 3 characters that can be romanced by males and have to have completely different dialogue for males or females. These 3 characters who are completely romanced by females and have completely different dialogue, and like there's one in the middle, like Liara, for example, who is just kind of universal. Do you think it's harder to code that, or these 5 characters, or 6, or whatever it is, who can be romanced regardless, and the only thing you change is the pronouns? The whole feeling of the whole everyone is bi thing felt incredibly lazy, and I did some looking into several of the scenes and because I was wanting to see the dialogue, and as expected, the dialogue was exactly the same with only a few changes. Now, maybe they were trying to make a statement, maybe they were trying to, be cool with it. I don't know. I don't care, because it was lazy. I'm sorry, but it was. Maybe they had a deadline issue, maybe someone was saying, we have to do this. Oh my god, we don't have time to actually properly do this. Or zones, we can't make different zones. Every place will be the same cave. Maybe that was the problem they were having with the romance options. But to be completely and utterly frank, I don't get why BioWare has had this romance option is required as part of their games things for forever. I don't. I've never gotten that. It's been like a rule since the beginning. All the way back in Baldur's Gate. And, you guys, if deadline is that much of an issue, don't do romance options. Or delay it. Or do it as a DLC. A free DLC. Yeah, no one's paying for that. I know I'm probably going out on a limb here, because I bet a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but the whole thing just felt so lazy and so rushed. There we go. Rushed. That's actually the real word I want to use, because I can't necessarily say it was lazy. It is more likely deadline was the issue than lack of caring, because there was a degree of feeling of caring in Dragon Age 2. There was a feeling that at least some of the people involved actually did care about their jobs and were trying. But the whole game, every single element of it, all of it, the combat, the story, the characterization, the writing, the romance options, the inventory, the UI, the setting, all felt rushed. And of course, the final part, which I'm now getting to, is the ending, if you could call it that. The lack of ending in Dragon Age 2 is almost astonishing. And again, for a long time, that didn't really bother me until about a month and a half ago, whenever the hell Mass Effect 3 came out. That didn't bother me because it was supposed to be a bridge. It wasn't supposed to end. It was supposed to be continued. You know, like Pirates of the Caribbean 2. That was not supposed to end. That was supposed to lead into Pirates of the Caribbean 3, and it did, and it was great. The catch is now Dragon Age 3 has the automatic... they've built up an obligation, even if Mass Effect 3 never happened, even if we still had all of the loyalty we still had to BioWare. What they have done is created an artificial expectation that they did. Not that we did. They put out this thought of to be continued. Anytime you do to be continued, you have set yourself up, and you have to match up... You have to match up to the standards you have put forth in order to make that to be continued worth it. Because people hate to be continued. I don't know if you know this, and I know not everyone thinks this way, but when you're talking about an audience as a whole, a consumer base as a whole, whether it be movie, TV, video game, whatever, to be continued are three of the most hated words to be seen in such a thing. And every time you do that, you have to be prepared to deliver in whatever it is continued with, or else you're going to have problems. Mass Effect 3. And so... that's the problem we're at, is Dragon Age 2's ending was very to be continued. It was designed very clearly, just like Pirates of the Caribbean 2. That's the best example I could give you. If you don't know how it ends like sh-k-k-kong, and then, to be continued, it just ended right there. And it was clearly just nothing but a setup for 3. Now they delivered in 3. But my point is, they have to deliver now in 3, Dragon Age 3. Or else that ending is going to get much worse in hindsight and in retrospect than it already is. And while I'm on the subject, I just feel like adding one additional thing. I've seen some talk about what they're doing in Dragon Age 3. I unfortunately was looking for the link recently and I couldn't find it. Someone was talking about how the Elysium choice with Morgan, the person who was being interviewed, didn't think that was a significant enough choice to really have anything in Dragon Age 3. I violently disagree, especially since that whole Elysium choice thing was exactly what I was just talking about, that to be continued. Morgan, when you finally catch up to her at the end of the Witch Hunt DLC, basically you might as well just have put a giant picture over the screen here. There we go, picture on the screen, and all this picture says is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing, 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 and then you go through the Elysium, or you kill her, or whatever the hell happens, right? You can't just drop something like that. I mean, you can, you just shouldn't, if you know what I mean. And so there's been a lot of talk about the whole Skyrimization, the Elder Scrollsization, whatever you want to call that, of Dragon Age 3, which may or may not work out. I am not enthusiastic about that. That's never been BioWare's thing. The last time they pulled off something like that was Baldur's Gate 2. They did a good job of it in Baldur's Gate 2, but that's still very different from what they're talking about. And that was a while ago. Nothing... I hate to say this, I really do. Nothing I've seen about Dragon Age 3 has filled me with hope or, enthusiasm. More like dread. I still do have hope that Dragon Age 3 will pull off what most of us want it to, and will be the fulfillment of the to be continued like it should. But the fact that they've already said the Warden's story is over is bothersome, because the Warden's story isn't over. I think I said this before. The Warden's story is not over. It ended, or rather, it stopped. It didn't end. The Warden, beat the thing, and then did whatever at the witch hunt, and then vanished. Just vanished flat. And I have a phone call from AT&T. Sorry about that. It's ironic that came, because I was like 2 sentences away from being done. But I just want to add, here at the end, that while I do still have hope for Dragon Age 3, and I do still hope it will be the fulfillment that all of us want, that all of us wanted Mass Effect 3 to be, ultimately, it is unfortunate that, almost by necessity, what happens with Dragon Age 3 will reflect on Dragon Age 2, because of the style in which they did Dragon Age 2, which was to be that bridge in the story, to be the branch between Dragon Age 1 and Dragon Age 3. And as much as I would like to take the game on its own, just on its own merits, it's not really possible to do. The best way I could possibly show that is the end, the finale. Which person, which organization you side with, the mages or the Templars, doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter, it's not because they wanted to take away the choice, it's because they needed the war to start, and they needed to show that both sides are wrong. And that was good. I actually liked that. I actually liked the fact that they were continuing that theme from Dragon Age, that no matter which side you back, and I'm sorry, you know what, I'm going to keep going for just a little bit, because there's one other thing Dragon Age 2 did very well that I forgot to mention. The background story of the mages versus the Templars was extremely well done in Dragon Age 2. And I'm going to explain why as briefly as I can. Neither side was right. Neither side was wrong. Both sides had people who were extremist. Both sides had people who were decent, honest people. Both sides had people who were screwed up in the head and evil. Both sides... It was a Cold War scenario. For anyone who was alive during that era, or has read about that era, knows about the Cold War. You know what I'm talking about. Both sides were ultimately in basically the exact same boat. And they were both staring at each other, and they were just staring at each other down. And there's just this balance here. This balance of the Cold War. That's exactly where it was at. I'm sorry. Let's make it rotate to the camera there. And the whole time through Dragon Age 2, who you support... more or less, at least in my case, in my opinion, came down more to a case-by-case basis. This time the Templars were okay, but this time the mages were okay, and this time the Templars were okay, and this time the mages were okay, and so forth and so on. And so, but ultimately, and I don't know if you saw me doing this, I was just kind of cricking my finger just a little bit. That's to get across the point that in the overall balance of the power here, between the mages and the Templars, nothing actually changed. What finally set it off was Anders, and I actually thought that was the appropriate culmination of his story, which for all intents and purposes has now ended. He will probably be in Dragon Age 3, assuming you didn't kill him, but you get the idea. His story has culminated in the fact that he bombed the place, the Chantry place, not because he wanted to kill her, not because he wanted to do anything, because he was tired of this right here. He was an extremist, for good or for bad, for right or for wrong. Anders was an extremist, and he wanted this balance to go away. And so, like in all of those Cold War fiction, all the video games, all the books, all the movies that came out around the Cold War about how the war finally actually exploded into a real war, the spark was lit. And that's all it took, because what that did was got rid of this support right here. And then it just started doing this thing. And that war will consume the entire planet, as it should. And I thought that was very well done. And that was probably, story-wise, setting-wise, probably the single most enjoyable aspect of Dragon Age 2 for me. And of course, this drags back into the Dragon Age 3 problem, is the fact that now needs to be delivered. That story, the one that has been building from Dragon Age 1, now needs to be delivered in Dragon Age 3, and hopefully delivered well. So, I've talked a little longer than I want, now I need to go edit this in order to post this, but... that is my opinion on Dragon Age 2. Overall, a good game. Not exactly a fantastic game, not a stellar game. Something I did enjoy, something I will be replaying sometime in the future. And here's hoping that Dragon Age 3 will be good. At the very least, good. That's all I'm asking, guys. Make it good. You don't have to make it great. I'd love it if you made it great. Anyways, but that's that.